Siobhain, should spending on public services be the priority of a Labour government?
It's always going to be the priority of a Labour government, isn't it? That's what we came into being to do, to provide a better society.
There's no promise to put more money in. In fact, with unprotected departments, as we found out from the budget last week, as a result of the figures, they're going to have to be cut. If you win the election this year, they're cuts you're going to have to make.
I don't think it's any secret that without growing the economy, we're not going to have more money.
This is it. They just every single answer to every question. So there's a clip that you might watch later. It's from this interview that Sophie Ridge did with Keir Starmer for her Politics Hub show today, where she presses him over and over again about what are you going to do about all of these cuts? What are you going to do about the state of the finances, knowing that given the changes in the tax regime in the most recent budget, if you want to find the funding in your household budget model for all of these things that you're going to be spending on public services, on council budgets, councils going bust literally now, that they said they won't bail out, despite the last Labour government bailing out the banks. They keep saying, oh, well, as long as we grow the economy. And I'm like, you can't just wait until the economy is growing to fix all these public services, especially not when the growth that is necessary in the economy is predicated on those public services functioning properly. Failing schools, failing hospitals, failing councils. These are all sources of low growth. You can't just say, well, we'll not fix these things until we've got growth, because those are part of the strategy for that growth in the first place. It's a completely kind of self-defeating financial and fiscal strategy for running a country. It's like waiting for a plant to grow before watering it.
Money to do the things we want to do. Nobody could look at our hospitals and think they're great. Nobody could do an advice surgery as an MP and see the number of kids waiting 18 months for an appointment with mental health services and think that's okay. Most of us came into politics to deal with those issues.
So why not oppose the tax cuts to national insurance and instead say that a future Labour government would commit that money, several £billion, to the National Health Service?
Because Rachel Reeves is absolutely right. We're being taxed more highly now than we were in the 1950s. Yeah. Also, I mean, you have to grow the economy. You have to build the houses, do the science and research that are the areas that will actually bring us more money and give us.
Well, then she goes, well, now back in the 1950s. I'm like, well, in the 1950s, we were building council houses. We'd nationalised sections of the economy. We had a thriving industrial sector back in the 1950s. If you're saying we should go back to the economic stratifications of the 50s, then I'm like, yeah, sure, let's do that. If that requires more taxation, that's fine. I just think that maybe that taxation should come from rich people, as we've seen from what has been proposed by the Green Party about wealth taxation from Caroline Lucas and from Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall on BBC yesterday, or a segment we'll watch later on with Carla Denyer as well. Like, there's plenty of ways that you could raise the funds for extra money for public services. They just don't want to do it. And they keep using this excuse of, oh, well, the tax burden's high. Yeah, on like normal people, not on the super rich. They don't pay anything because they don't even pay income. They don't get incomes, so they don't pay income tax. So therefore, you need to tax something else, which is capital gains or it's dividends, or it's potentially wealth, but they won't do these things.
Money to do the things we'd really love to do.
Right. The real problem, I think, is that we have absolutely no indication as to how the Labour Party is allegedly going to grow the economy. You know, even the Chinese Communist Party, which has unprecedented control over the entire economy, is not able to magic growth out of thin air when the global economy is in a bit of a difficult situation. We have the £28 billion pledge to invest in decarbonisation. That's gone.
Well, we don't. Oh, yeah, I was going to say.
It's gone, basically, you know. And so it's kind of like, where is this magical growth going to come from? Unless you can kind of just wave a magic wand and expect the global economy to come out of a...
Let's see what Siobhain says.
Well, what I'm excited about is to hear Keir Starmer talk about building houses, reforming the planning system. I mean, for a long time, it's a bit of a niche policy, but I've been campaigning on building on the green belt with a professor from the London School of Economics, and he reckons there are 1 million homes you could build close to outer London train stations, and the prospect of getting a home for the children that I see who've never had a permanent home, and the prospect of people being able to get on the ladder and buy.
And then again, they say, oh, well, we're going to be building 1.5 million homes. And their only policy for this is, as she said, about deregulating the planning sector. And that's their way of guaranteeing their pledge of 1.5 million homes. We know what a Labour pledge is worth nowadays. not more than the paper it's written on. But even that singular pledge is predicated on this idea that they can just regulate the planning sector and the homes just kind of magic themselves out of the ether. As if you can just guarantee that the private sector are then A, going to build, B, are going to build the right housing that's necessary, and C, that it's actually going to get sold to owner-occupiers. I'll either be sold to landlords or for people for short-term lets, or for institutional investors keeping them empty so that they've got a nest egg. These are all people that could potentially buy these things. So unless they're actually going to take action to regulate short-term lets so that those things stop, so that landlords can't be the ones who snap up all of these new houses, and to prevent institutional investors from gobbling these things up to maximise their portfolio, then it's just going to be a waste of time when we could be building council houses.
Sure, but Grace, do you believe they'll be able to do that? That Labour in government will be able to bulldoze through opposition, which will be fierce, to an awful lot of the planning applications?
On the basis of what we've currently heard from the Labour Party, no, and not just because of the planning system, because building housing, if you do it properly, requires investment. The problem that we're going to see, and we saw from Keir Starmer the other day, is that this plan to build lots of houses relies on private developers who we know drip feed housing into the market to maintain their profits. The time that the Labour Party stood up for the NHS, stood up for working people and built lots of housing was immediately after the Second World War, when you had, yes, a big increase in borrowing to transform the country that ultimately led to longer growth over the long term, because it was investment in people, it was investment in the economy, led by a proud socialist contingent of MPs.
Actually, I think that the Labour's view about having a wealth fund to do these projects, to unleash money in the private sector, only in my own small way. I've just recently written to the top 10 pension funds in the country in an effort to try and get some money in my local area, in Mitcham, where Jeff will know, to build temporary accommodation.
But you don't need to do this. It's always cheaper for the public sector to borrow than to try and convince private investors to do it for you.
Let me bring the...
She's absolute 100% correct. Again, all of this is predicated on just this going to guarantee that these things will happen. I'm sure they've put the feelers out to try and get all of this private investment. But at the end of the day, one of the reasons our country is so sure of public investment, first of all, is because of austerity, but second of all, because coffers are getting emptier and emptier every year, because our state has no assets. There was an amazing video by Gary's Economics over the weekend about the fact that the state not owning the assets and selling them off to other people essentially means that the economic rent flows towards the private sector and rich individuals rather than towards the state for the good of everybody. And that's what council housing is for. Rather than having to pay this huge budget in housing benefit to people who can't afford their rent, because of course they can't, rents are too high, that feeds state money into the pockets of private landlords, we could be investing new money, new fiscal expansionary money, right, as an expansionary policy on new supply of houses, council houses for putting people in for them to live in rather than for investors to buy or to use on Airbnb. We could then take that money that otherwise would be being spent on housing benefit, build council housing with it, and then that then generates returns for the council. So actually, not only then for not spending housing benefit, we're also getting money back in return. So you'll double your money by building council housing. Whereas their plan is just going to feed even more money into the private sector.
People are so sick of hearing politicians say, we are the party of change, only for them to come into office and then get dragged immediately into the centre by the vested interests that do have a massive influence, not just over the political parties, but over our democracy as a whole.
The only thing is, Grace, is politically, what happened in 2019 when there was...
we're going to cut off Grace when she's rightly condemning the fact that corporate interests have bought our democracy. Oh, no, you can't reveal the fact that both of the two main political parties have got huge amounts of donations from incredibly rich private individuals. Don't mention Gary Lubner, don't mention Lord Sainsbury, don't mention Trevor Chin. We all can't mention the big donors. No, managed democracy, what's that? Anyway, let's discuss the Corbyn Jam Man, Jumbly Crumbly Concrete.
It was a radical prospectus put forward by Jeremy Corbyn. It was Labour's worst ever election defeat.
Look, I mean, that particular set of policies was obviously very popular, and the coalition behind that was carved up by this combination, this very successful combination of culture war and saying we're going to fix the economy.
You think the policies were right, the economic policies, even though...
The policies got 40% in 2017, 40% of the vote. It's almost where Labour are polling now after a complete Tory collapse after they destroyed the country. The policies, when they admitted that they were going to stick with Brexit in 2017, have a jobs first Brexit and focused on regular policy before all the smears had happened, right? All the terrorist sympathiser stuff, those policies got 40% of the vote, almost 41% of the vote. It's clear that the policies were popular. Again, memory holing 2017. They always do this. It was 2019, terrible result. 2017, same policies, 40% of the vote. What changed? The two things that changed was the media campaign to demonise Jeremy Corbyn and Brexit, second referendum, stupid policy. Which, to be fair, you can lay at the feet of both Keir Starmer and John McDonagh, and it was silly.
It's the only time that we've had radical change in this country has not actually come from politicians turning around and deciding we're going to do things differently. It's come from working people organising in the streets, in their communities, and saying we demand a different kind of economy. It was the Labour movement.
Well,
it's not. It was the Labour movement that founded the Labour Party and that supported politicians like Niall Elland on the far left of the party at the time, far left of the party at the time, to create the NHS in the midst of massive opposition within the state from the doctors, from every part of society.
And there was a phrase, I think, at the time, having just seen the play, that in the end he had to stuff their mouths with gold in order for it to happen.
We need people
but you
power,
say she's
not
completely
just more
wrong.
politicians.
Oh, she's absolutely completely wrong. Life expectancy increased under the last Labour government. People's incomes improved. Our schools were transformed.
Okay, wonder what you're going to talk about the PFI contracts in those schools, are you, Siobhain? You're going to talk about that, are we? We're going to talk about the gigantic financial bubble that got the economic growth that then forced us to massively deficit.
I'm actually very right wing, and I loved it.
We're going to talk about the fact that the economic growth was from a financial sector that was inevitably going to crash because we didn't bother having any proper prudential regulation or capital controls. Again, the fault of Thatcherism and the Labour government that then adopted those policies. We were getting growth before Blair came into power in 97. He didn't really change much. He did really good on social reform. I'll give him that. His social reforms were good. When it came to the economy, he inherited a growing economy. He didn't bother raiding in the financial sector and then coasted off of that growth as well. And on public services, he didn't bother spending any of his own money. He got in PFI contracts that were like 20% worth the money. Like on £15 billion PFI contracts, we ended up spending £80 billion worth of debt in return. That doesn't sound like good value for money, Siobhain, to me. And again, the idea that she's saying, it's completely wrong that people organising in their communities is what brought radical change in this country. I mean, it's literally true. You may say, it was electoral politics that got Labour elected in 1945, and that's true. But back in those periods, in that time, the Labour Party was a method of getting working class people representation in Westminster. Now look at what the Labour Party looks like. It's a bunch of barristers and lawyers and spads and people from the NGOs and charity sectors, or mates of people who are already in the Labour Party, or people from lobby journalists like Paul Moore, or it's people who are just in the parliamentary staffers or career politicians. When was the last time you had a proper somebody from a working class background who did a real job elected as a Labour MP? When was the last time? You can't find him. They're not there. On the front bench, the only person there who's actually like a person from a real job is Angela Rayner. She worked in care. And she's only there because she got elected there. But back in 1945, it was a movement of people demanding change. People who fought in the war demanding change. The trade unionists who stood beside them demanding that change. The literal Labour Party. And the fact that Siobhain can say that's rubbish about working people organising their communities just shows how far removed she is from the trade union movement that she claims to represent.
Our NHS waiting lists were down. There were lots and lots. You can always do more. I think it was Wilson who said that Labour is nothing if not a crusade, that there's always more to do. Of course there is. But the idea that you can't improve things, which I think is actually the Conservative argument, you can't do everything and they're all as bad as one another.
Are you going to do anything different? You're not going to do anything different?
But of course we're going to do something different.
What, with the same spending plans? With the same fiscal rules? It doesn't sound very different to me, Siobhain.
We're going to concentrate on building houses, developing science, developing our science in order to bring about growth in our economy so we can actually do the things that we came into politics to do.
You've written a book, Vulture Capitalism. It's obviously addressing some of the things that
touches on all of this,
that we have been talking about. What are you actually proposing now, then, as a prospectus to change the country, change the economy and reduce inequality?
Sure. So look, I think our politics for a very long time now has been stuck in this basically sterile divide between people who say more market and people who say more state. And what we don't actually recognise is the fact that most of the people in positions of power, whether that's in the public or private sector, basically work together to achieve the same ends, whether that's, the government bailing out the banks or whether it's, big corporations lobbying the major political parties. So what we need is real democracy, right? And that has to be built from the grassroots up. So, we've got some amazing, I look in the book at some fantastic examples of things like community wealth building, where local communities are working with their kind of local governments to say, we're going to develop cooperatives, we're going to develop community banking, we're going to actually challenge the concentrations of power, the gross concentrations of power in our society from the bottom up, and that's what I want to see more of. And I want to see Labour supporting that.
Well,
I think it's the big irony is that there are so many sections of the Labour Party that do support this. Preston Council, been doing community wealth building for ages. It's literally called the Preston model, colloquially in the UK. My local council just turned Labour. They're all hot on community wealth building, and I'm glad they are. Look at Salford, places like that. There are plenty of Labour people on the ground, membership of the Labour Party, who support all of these things. The radical devolution of power to workers rather than owners was a big part of the 2017 and 2019 manifestos. Inclusive ownership funds moving shares of 10% into workers' hands for large companies was a way of putting stuff back into workers' hands. The right to own, where if any business was being sold or floated, workers would be buyers of first refusal to ensure that they could turn it into a co-op if they needed to. And these were all ways of transferring power from the corporate class into the hands of regular people to get rid of this corporatocracy that we live in. Was it ever given any airtime? No, too busy talking about broadband communism. But she's really good. I mean, this is like a Richard Wolff style argument about developing a cooperative sector and building communities, building credit unions, like what the trade unions used to do, building societies, all these mutualist institutions that maintain wealth inside communities rather than it being all siphoned off into the pockets of shareholders by these big businesses who can outcompete your local grocers. And the thing is, despite the fact that all the Labour Party support that on the ground, or loads of the Labour Party do any of the people in the Starmer Politburo support that stuff? Do they fuck? They couldn't give a shit about that. It's been proven to work, proven to improve people's lives in Preston. Is it part of the Labour Party's national mission? No. Not in the slightest. Doesn't even touch it. And the membership cannot even have any say over it, because all this policy is being set by unknown lobbyists that, according to Open Democracy, Starmer and co won't even tell us about. Great. Love it. Fantastic. Brilliant.
You should.
This headline, Siobhain, in the Eye, Labour rules out taxing wealthy to avoid £20 billion worth of cuts, which would be to some departments. You're ahead in the polls by a long way. Why not promise something a bit more radical?
Do you remember the 1992 general election?
I do.
Yeah, I spent my time...
Have they yassified Bowler Hat Man and invited him onto Politics Live? We can't do anything good because of 1992, as if just the world has been in stasis for 32 years. It's a different electorate. It's a different time. We've gone through the pandemic. We've lived through the war economy of that. It's not the kind of booming economy that we had in the run-up to 92. Despite the tiredness people have for the Conservatives, they were still wary about the credentials of the Labour Party under Kinnock. That's not the same now. Labour are ahead on every single metric when surveyed. The 26 points ahead in the polls are like 5 points ahead sometimes and equal other times. Like, how can you make these 92 comparisons? It's so stupid. It doesn't make any sense.
I'm going out on the streets of Mitcham with a ready reckoner saying, don't worry, we're going to increase child benefit, we're going to increase pensions, and you won't pay any more tax because you don't earn £25,000 a year. It's precisely because once you did that, you couldn't control the argument. And the idea that the polls say X or Y and it's what's going to happen is for the birds.
Fucking neoliberalism.
The economy that we live in today is the legacy of conservative Thatcherism and then its kind of, concretization by Blair. And you saw inequality increase sharply over the 1980s, and then it's kind of stayed a bit similar since then. And then over austerity, it seems to have increased some more. And people are really concerned about that. So it does beg the question. There is this open goal. You tax wealth, you tax big corporations, and you use that to pay for an increase in public services, which are basically, on the verge of collapsing across the economy.
Which was what we were trying to do with the non-dom status, with...
Oh, £3 billion from the non-dom status. That's going to fix the NHS and schools and 40% council cuts. It's going to fix everything. The magical power of the non-dom tax status. Oh my God. These Labour MPs are so terrible. They're so awful. What, like, they're just every single day, they're just like a walking comms disaster. Like, imagine if Liz Truss hadn't happened. Like, how? How would they win? Like, when Jeff Norcott is here going, actually, we need to tax the billionaires. Danny Kruger here going, actually, we need to devolve power to local people through mutualism. Like, actual kind of, literal actual sewer socialism. On a local authority level. And you've got Siobhain McDonagh saying, well, actually, we need to make sure that we crowd in the private sector by offering them bungs with extra funding coming from the business bank. And we need to not actually nationalise anything and not tax the wealthy and reduce inequality and keep the same failed model after 13 years. I'm just like, what? My mind is broken. Like, how do I commentate on this complete inversion of what our political spectrum should look like? Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.